All right, before I start anything, does anyone have any issues with the Lab Connect? Is anyone running into problems completing the lab? Are certain images not coming up? Um, Please let me know now or send me an email. I've had a couple of emails already. I think the biggest thing is using the proper device. I think it's hard on a phone. I heard people are having issues on their cell phone, as well as the proper browser. So I use Chrome. Chrome seems to work really well with these online lab resources as well as Canvas. Safari, I had some issues using Safari. I use Mac products, so or Apple products. Sorry. Um, so I had some issues with using Safari and Canvas together. So I've been using Chrome for everything. But if anyone's have any issues, let me know. Okay. Um, you do not have a quiz this week. You start having quizzes next week. Um, and what else? Yeah, chapter 2 today. That's pretty much it. And then I'll run through the lab just a little bit. It's a diffusion lab with some biological molecules, and I'll kind of give you a brief lecture today about what the lab is going to be. I went to the lab last night a couple of times to see how it was. It's a little finicky, so if you have any problems, don't worry. We can try to clear them up by Monday. Okay. Um, yeah. But other than that, any questions? Just let me know. All right, we'll get through this lecture really quick. It's a short lecture, so it might not be the full hour. All right. I think we were at the beginning first. All right, chapter 2, Central Chemistry for Biology. All right. So why is chemistry important in biology? And one of the main things to think about is chemistry is chemical reactions, changing of matter, new chemical bonds. Um, our metabolisms are based in chemistry. Okay, breaking down organic molecules is a chemistry step for our body to actually utilize those chemicals to for energy and building up our bodies or making energy, right? So we have catabolic and anabolic reactions, which we'll talk about later, right? Catabolic is to break down. You're destroying those molecules for energy purposes, such as ATP. Um, Also, anabolic is a little bit different in that it's building. Okay, so um, these are all chemistry processes, right? These are all going to be things that our body will utilize either to build itself up or break itself down, and chemistry is a huge component to that. So think of anabolic. I know we haven't gotten to there, but I mentioned anabolic, anabolism, or anabolic uh, processes are going to be things that build up the body. So think of anabolic steroid use. The guys take the steroids, guys or girls, take the steroids in order to build themselves up, right? The anabolic growth, anabolic steroids, they want to get bigger. Catabolic, we break down, okay? But we'll talk about those a little bit later. So matter, elements and compounds. So matter is anything that occupies space and has mass, okay? Mass, a measure of the amount of matter in an object. Element, a substance that cannot be broken down into other substances by chemical means. Scientists recognize 92 chemical elements that occur naturally and several dozen more that have been created in the laboratory. And you're like, what the heck? How do they create elements in laboratories? Well, the super colliders. I don't know if you've ever heard of like the big European super collider. I believe we have one in the US as well. And literally, it's this giant ring where they accelerate these atoms at really high velocities, and they just crash them into each other, so their nuclei can fuse or break apart depending on what they're trying to accomplish with that. Okay, so they usually take super heavy elements, and which I'll kind of point out in a minute uh, on the elemental chart, and they just smash them together and they try to make these new elements. I think beryllium or berkelium is one of the newer elements made by the in made by the Ivy League school or the UC Berkeley. Um, And they have other means of making elements. There's radioactive decay as well. So they have these big they have these big reactors where nuclear reactions are going on. They make these really interesting elements here, the laboratory made ones. But the other elements, the 92, that occur naturally, we can typically isolate, okay, without having to collide atoms together to create. Okay? These are like fluoride, chlorine, sodium, mercury, gold, lead, silver. These are all very, well, I would say common elements, but these are all elements that we can find naturally in their state. Okay, or we can isolate them by compound, a substance containing two or more different elements in a fixed ratio. For example, table salt consists of one atom of element sodium for every atom of chlorine. Okay, and you can think of water as a compound as well. H2O, two hydrogens with one oxygen. Okay, so those of you who haven't had chemistry yet, we'll kind of go through a little bit of the periodic table and how to look at those different elements. So again, here we have the majority of the naturally occurring elements, right? We have hydrogen, helium, lithium, beryllium, sodium, magnesium. I'm not going to make you memorize these or even get into too much of the chemistry, but it's important to note that we do have 92 naturally occurring elements that we do not have to crash the nuclei into each other into giant super colliders or isolate through radioactive decay, okay? So we have an atomic number here. This is going to denote the number of protons. Okay, so carbon has 6 protons, boron has 5, beryllium has 4, lithium 3, helium 2, hydrogen 1. Okay, and they go in ascending and descending order depending on how you look at the periodic table, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, right? It's going to go in order. All right, and the top number is always going to be that atomic number or the amount of protons. All right, we'll talk about protons in a little bit. Element symbol is going to be this in the middle, this letter. And again, you don't have to know any of the elements. We're just going to talk about a couple of them and why they're important to the human body or why they're important in biological systems. Okay, the atomic mass is a mass of average element of an atom, which we'll talk about in a bit, right? It's going to be related to that atomic number. Okay. All right. So we have different elements that are going to be required for life. Okay. Too little copper in your diet causes brain damage. Too much can harm organs. You also need iron. You need trace elements. But the majority of your body is going to be, or the majority of an organic animal or an organic organism is going to be oxygen, hydrogen, nitrogen, and carbon. Okay, so carbon makes a huge percentage of the total weight, right? And these are going to be the main elements, right? So the carbon, the oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen, right? And why are these compounds or these elements here making up the total amount of weight? They're the most abundant, right? And also they have the ability to form different bonds. Okay, so carbon can form 4 bonds, nitrogen can essentially form 5 to 3 with another element. So they're able to bind really well or make compounds really well with other elements. Okay, so it's important to know, and they're like building blocks in biological systems, right? Carbon is a great building block because it has the ability to form 4 bonds. Okay, all right. So you also have trace elements, right? So these are typically metal elements that are going to be required in your diet, right? You do need iron, you need iodine, zinc. All of these are going to be required. Manganese. Plants also utilize magnesium for their chlorophyll or that organelle that is actually able to fix carbon, right? So it absorbs sunlight to gain energy and has the ability to carbon fixate or make sugars, right? So there's a lot of different elements which we'll go over in the semester, but just know that oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen are going to be making up the majority of what the human body utilizes, right? This is going to be the majority of the elements that we use in biological systems, okay? This is typical for pretty much everything. All right, so diet and goiter. So eating foods rich in iodine, a trace element, can prevent goiter and enlargement of the thyroid gland. So your thyroid requires a certain percentage of iodine in the diet, okay? And this is why we have something called iodized salt. So it's important to have that supplementation in your diet because we can actually not consume iodine. Therefore, our thyroid gland might not be performing adequately, and you can develop this condition called goiter, which is the enlargement of the thyroid gland. When that occurs without the presence of enough iodine in your diet. So again, we do supplement our salt with iodine. So this is why you see iodized salt, right? You can have simple salt or plain salt, but it's probably better to buy that iodized salt just to prevent this goiter. And again, you see goiter in low-income countries or third world countries where they don't have diet supplementation, right? So you go to the store and there's plenty of diet supplementation in your food. If you didn't know that, there's a couple of viral videos going around where they're saying there's iron in your cereal, and they had a magnet and they pulled out these bits and pieces of iron. Well, that iron is supposed to be there. We need that iron in our diet, right? And so, you know, having those little pieces of metal isn't that big of a deal, nor is it bad for you. It's actually good for you, right? Having iodine in your salt is not bad for you. It actually prevents certain conditions because we need this trace element, right? We need certain types of elements to maintain a normal, healthy body and homeostasis, okay? So just keep that in mind, right? So atom, smallest unit of matter that retains the properties of an element. So we have a nucleus. In the nucleus, we do have a proton and a neutron. These are the two atomic particles that actually retain weight, okay? So a proton will contribute to that atomic mass that I mentioned earlier, okay? Oops. And then an electron, which is going to have a negative charge, is going to be circling that nucleus, okay? So protons and electrons do have charges, whereas electrons really don't have weight, okay? A neutron does have weight, as I believe an atomic weight of 1, or around 1, just like a proton. And again, these two particles are going to contribute to the atomic mass or the atomic weight that I showed you earlier, right? A proton, again, is going to be that atomic number, right? So carbon and well, hydrogen's 1, then it's helium is 2, then it goes so on and so forth. And that's going to be referring to the amount of protons that are in that nucleus, okay? The total atomic mass is going to be the protons plus the neutrons, okay? So protons plus the neutrons, so carbon, in a carbon atom's nuclei, we do have 6 protons as well as 6 neutrons, okay? So the atomic mass is the average mass of that element. And again, it's going to be referring to that. It's going to give you the total amount of neutrons as well, okay? So atomic number is the protons. This is going to be the total mass with the neutrons and protons put together, okay, in that nucleus. All right. So again, if you have 6 protons in carbon, and it's carbon-12, we will also have 6 neutrons, okay? The electrons don't play into the atomic mass, they're way too small, all right? But again, only protons and electrons have charges, right? So protons have a positive charge, neutrons have a neutral charge, and electrons have a negative charge. Again, protons and neutrons are in that nucleus, okay? All right, so this is a simplified helium atom. This model shows the subatomic particles in an atom of helium. The electrons move very fast, creating a spherical cloud of negative charge surrounding the positively charged nuclei or nucleus. So what is a cloud? So when you think of, well, I guess we're getting into atomic chemistry, which is not what this course is about. But when they explain how the electrons are moving around the nucleus, we think of it as a cloud, because it's hard to predict where this electron is going to be in comparison to the nucleus. Okay, and remind you, these are the smallest particles that we can look at. This is the smallest thing you can divide anything into, right? These subatomic particles here, and this nucleus is going to be surrounded by these electrons that are moving constantly, right? The electrons are going to be attracted to that nucleus, and they're going to be moving at a constant rate and forming something called an electron cloud. Okay, and it's just this area where these electrons are bouncing around in extreme velocities, making this cloud and this spherical kind of area where it is protected by that electron. Okay, and again, it's going to be surrounding that nucleus. Right. So when they talk about that negatively charged cloud surrounding, this is going to be referring to those electrons surrounding that nucleus. Okay. So do understand that concept just a bit, right? You have a nucleus, you have electrons. The nucleus is going to have a positive charge. Those neutrons are going to be neutral. Therefore, that positive charge is going to be maintained. And then you have these electrons that are going to be surrounding that nucleus, bouncing around, moving around. Think of it as like a really fast moving satellite, right? We have so many satellites in the Earth's atmosphere now. Think of the Earth as a nucleus, and think of all those satellites as electrons just kind of surrounding the Earth, making a blanket, right, of space junk. Same thing here. This is going to be the electron cloud. Okay. Structure of atoms. Proton is a subatomic particle with a single unit of positive electrical charge found in the nucleus. An electron, a substance particle with a single unit of negative electrical charge. One or more electrons move around the nucleus of an atom, again forming that cloud. Neutron, an electrical neutral particle, a particle having no electrical charge found in the nucleus of an atom. Okay, and the nucleus, an atom's central core containing protons and neutrons. We will also be using the same word to define the center of a eukaryotic cell. Okay, so that'll be later. We'll be talking about the nucleus of animal cells later. It's going to be an area where the DNA is maintained, as well as mRNA being created. But again, we'll get to that later. As far as right now, a nucleus is defining that atom's core with the protons and the neutrons. Okay. All right. So now it gets into some interesting chemistry. Isotopes. So isotopes are a variant form of an atom. Different isotopes of an element have the same number of protons and electrons, but different numbers of neutrons. Okay. So you can have different types of hydrogen elements. Okay. Or different types of hydrogen atoms, rather. Sorry. So you have protium or regular hydrogen, you have deuterium, and you have tritium. Okay. So radioactive isotopes, an isotope whose nucleus decays spontaneously, giving off particles and energy. Okay, so radioactivity, we all kind of understand that radioactivity is not good, but you can have varying elements or isotopes of a single atom of hydrogen or carbon or many of the other elements, right? We do have radioactive isotopes. Again, this is just going to be an added neutron, okay? So an added neutron to that core, and it's going to kind of change this element or this atom and kind of have it as a radioactive form of it, okay? Because it's going to want to give off these neutrons. And these radioactive forms can be natural in the environment as well. One of the main things we talk about is carbon-14. So radiocarbon dating, we have naturally occurring isotopes of carbon called carbon-14, and they have 2 extra neutrons in that element, okay? And we can actually use this to go back to the fossil record and radiocarbon date those fossils using this carbon-14, right? This isotope of carbon, which has 2 extra neutrons. Right, so I'm assuming many of you have heard of carbon-14, and we can actually track the decay or the amount of carbon-14 in certain ancient biological sites So we can pull those carbon-14 molecules out. We can quantify the amount of carbon-14 there, and then we can radiocarbon date. Because again, there's a half-life to how long carbon-14 can last. The longer the carbon, or the less carbon-14 there is there, the older that molecule is, okay? So let's talk about these hydrogen isotopes here. So we have, again, a regular hydrogen atom, again, 1 electron and 1 neutron. If we go back to the periodic table, we see hydrogen is 1. And hydrogen does have a weight of about, I believe, 1. Yeah, I think it should be 1. So it should have 1 electron and 1 proton, okay? Here we have deuterium, which is something called heavy water, and it has 1 proton and 1 neutron, okay? And this is going to be an isotope of hydrogen, okay? Hydrogen is typically 1, right? So this is hydrogen with an atomic weight of 2. All right, so it has an extra proton here, and it can be slightly radioactive, okay? And you do have deuterium occurring naturally. Actually, deuterium is really expensive, so certain chemists will actually utilize this in different types of experimentation, and they call it heavy water. And it looks like regular water, but very, very, very expensive, okay? Especially of a deuterium, or sorry, it's heavy hydrogen, but you can have this hydrogen molecule associated with oxygen to make heavy water, okay? So deuterium. You also have something called tritium, okay? And tritium is radioactive as well, and it's more radioactive than deuterium. They actually use this in fluorescent tubing for, let's say, watches or markers on vehicles. And this has a half-life of about 10 to 12 years, okay? So the radioactive decay is actually visible. It's not harmful to humans. It's not too harmful, I'm assuming, because they put it in. They still, to this day, they put it into watches. They put it into fluorescent little tubing. So typically, you'll have like a glass tube, and it'll be filled with this tritium gas, and it fluoresces a very distinct color. And it's radioactive. It has a shining light. Even in dark, you don't need to have light exposed to it for it to fluoresce. This will shine for, again, about 10 to 12 years before it actually deteriorates. So again, that deterioration is going to be the loss of these neutrons, and then eventually it will go back to deuterium and then eventually back into hydrogen, okay? So these radioactive isotopes do decay back to their original element, okay? So again, isotopes, extra neutron. All right, so radiation in treating cancer. So you can have radioactive elements that can be used to treat different illnesses, okay? So radioactive seeds can be inserted into a prostate tumor in order to treat prostate cancers, and you see relative successful rates of cancer treatments with this, all right? So why does this work? Why does adding radiation therapy actually help? You know, some individuals kind of question or may not know or understand why you would treat a patient that's already sick with cancer with radiation, which is quite nasty, right? Like, we wouldn't go out and expose ourselves to radiation because it's definitely not good for us, right? We put on sunscreen to prevent ourselves from getting exposed to UV radiation. They tell us to cover up anytime we go into the dentist and take x-rays of our teeth, especially our organ systems and our bodies in general. So why can radiation be utilized to treat cancers? Well, if we understand what cancer is, they're fast-growing cells that are uncontrolled, okay? So that's essentially what cancer is. It's uncontrolled growth of your tissue, right? And it becomes cancerous. Well, radiation can give off, again, radioactive particles that actually can destroy DNA and fragment DNA. And those cells that are actively dividing much quicker than our normal tissues are more susceptible to being disrupted or destroyed by the radiation, right? Our normal healthy cells have check systems and have DNA repair mechanisms that'll prevent the cells from actually succumbing to the radioactive treatment, whereas typically cancer cells don't. They're rogue cells that are actively dividing at high rates, so this radiation will have a much more detrimental effect on those cancer cells, okay? This is why radiation works essentially, right? So radioactive seed implantation actually is very, very successful. So you see this seed implantation of radioactive material be much more effective at the 10-year mark, right? And again, the seed implantation treatment is site-directed. It's implanted directly in the prostate, which is going to be affected by those cancer cells, okay? At the 10-year mark, you see a much higher success rate, much more successful treatment strategy in comparison to surgery and external radiation, right? And external radiation makes sense. You're kind of blasting that whole area with radiation rather than having a site-directed treatment strategy for the cancer, for that prostate cancer, okay? So yeah, kind of cool. All right. Chemical bonding and molecules. Chemical bond, an attraction between two atoms resulting from a sharing of outer shell electrons or the presence of opposite charges on the atom. So there are three types of chemical bonds. We have ionic, covalent, and hydrogen bonds. All right, and you do need to know these three different bonds, so please pay attention. Okay. All right, so ionic bonds, think of ions, are atoms that have gained or lost one or more electrons, thus acquiring an electrical charge. So an ionic bond, an attraction between two ions with opposite electrical charges. The electrical attraction of the opposite charges holds the ions together. All right, so electron transfer and ionic bonding. When a sodium atom and a chlorine atom meet, the electron transfer between the two atoms results in two ions with opposite charges, okay? So an electron is stripped from sodium and added to chlorine, right? And this is going to be the sodium chloride or table salt that we consume probably every day. I think all of us consume salt probably every day, okay? So again, this is an ionic bond. The attraction between the ions and ionic bond holds the ions together, but again, they can be separated into their ions in aqueous solution. We'll talk about aqueous solution, but that's mainly referring to that as water, right? You can dissolve salt into water, and that's just separating them out into the sodium and chlorine in the water. But again, we don't really have to worry about the chemistry behind that. We just need to know that ionic bonds are dealing with ions, okay? And sodium chloride, potassium chloride are going to be great, I guess, great examples of this, right? So I'll probably ask you something like this on a quiz in our exam, okay? What's an example of an ionic bond? You can say sodium chloride, okay? Good example, okay? And the sharing of charges. So covalent bond, an attraction between atoms that share one or more pairs of electrons, all right? So covalent is sharing of electrons, whereas ions are donating the electron, okay? So ionic, donate, covalent, they're sharing, okay? These are considered the smallest and strongest bonds. I put quotations around strongest because it might not be the strongest depending on the bond forces, okay? And then it actually has to be calculated. So there are certain covalent bonds that are weaker than certain types of ionic bonds. It just depends. And that's up to, you know, the chemistry to determine whether or not the covalent or ionic bonds are going to be the strongest, right? According to your book, these are the smallest and strongest. But if you go and Google this, you'll find a whole different, you'll find a lot of differences in opinions on what's the strongest and how to actually calculate. So it's somewhere in between, I think. There are certain covalent bonds that are going to be weaker than ionic bonds and vice versa. We calculate this in chemistry by determining the bond energy and the amount of energy or joules required to break that bond, okay? So it's kind of contested here. So the book says this, so we're going to go with this, but I probably will not ask you a question given that it's not a true correct answer. Probably not the strongest bond. There are ionic bonds that are stronger than certain covalent bonds. So it's important to keep that in mind. Okay, a molecule is a group of two or more atoms held together by a covalent bonds. And again, we'll look at covalent bonds right here. So most of the organic molecules that we deal with are going to be held together by covalent bonds. So sugars, fats or lipids, proteins. Covalent bonding is very, very important, those molecules. Covalent bonding is going to be the majority of the biological bonds used, right? So these are the bonds that we actually make in our body in terms of anabolic growth. Okay, so remember, anabolism is growth. These are the bonds that we create in order to build up our bodies or build up our tissues or cells. Okay, life in general uses covalent bonds. All right, so molecular formulas such as CH2O tells you the number of each kind of atom in a molecule, but not how they are attracted to each other, or attached together, sorry. This figure shows 4 common ways of representing the arrangement of the atoms in the molecules. So we have an electron configuration, which is probably the most complex, right? It shows the sharing of those electrons, right? These are representations of the clouds that we talked about, or the shells. And you see the electrons being shared between the oxygen, carbon, and the 2 hydrogen molecules, okay? So you see here we have a double bond, so we have 4 electrons being utilized in this double bond, whereas these single bonds are going to be sharing just 2 electrons, one between the carbon, one between the hydrogen. So if you remember, we talked about carbon earlier being a very, very important element because it has the ability to form 4 bonds, okay? And this is kind of perfect in biological systems, right? These 4 bonds kind of allow the carbon molecules or the carbon atoms to be building blocks, or the structural building block of the majority of the organic molecules. Okay, and this is true, right? This is the main structural component of sugars, lipids, or sugars and fats. So very important. Carbon is extremely important. So here we have a space filling model, shows the shape of a molecule by symbolizing atoms with colored coded balls. So here we have oxygen, which is a little bit bigger than carbon, and then we have hydrogen molecules, which are going to be the smallest atom that we see. Okay, so we have a carbon atom, oxygen atom. Actually, the oxygen and carbon atom are about the same size here, which I don't like. It's fine. So this is a ball and stick model showing the arrangement of that CH2O molecule. Okay. Any questions so far? So I know I'm running through it quickly. So please stop me if you have any questions. Okay. So hydrogen bonds. So hydrogen bond are a type of weak chemical bond formed when a partially positive hydrogen atom from one polar molecule is attracted to a partially negative atom in another molecule or in another part of that same molecule. Okay. So what is a polar molecule? A molecule containing an uneven distribution of charge due to the presence of polar covalent bonds. Okay, so a polar molecule just means that you have a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on the other side, right? There's polarity, there's poles. There's one positive, one negative. Okay, this is just referring to the charge, and this makes sense, especially when we go and we look at this ball and stick model. You do have areas in these compounds that are, or these different elements that are associated with this compound to actually have charge here, right? So you see that the hydrogens are going to have those protons, and therefore they're going to be more charged, whereas those elements in the center are going to have a more of a negative charge. And this is true of water as well. So oxygen will have that negative charge because it has the electrons associated with that cloud here, and then hydrogen will have that positive charge just because it's one electron sharing towards this oxygen molecule, and then you have the positive nuclei in the center of that hydrogen atom, right? And this will give that positive charge. So hydrogen bonding in water is very, very important. We'll talk a little bit about the importance of water right now. The charged regions of the polar water molecules are attracted to oppositely charged areas of neighboring molecules. Each molecule can hydrogen bond to a maximum of 4 partners. Okay, that's very, very important to note. Again, and these dipole areas, or these areas of negative and positive charge, are going to be closely binding to each other. They're going to be more attracted to each other, right? So opposites do attract in terms of chemistry. So here we have the oxygen binding or being attracted to the hydrogen, or the protons in the hydrogen molecules, okay, and the different waters. So again, it's a very, very important characteristic of water. This allows water to be a very, very, very good solvent, right? And a solvent in terms of dissolving salts, right? So if you put sodium chloride in water, again, we have that dissociation between sodium and chlorine, right? And this just means, or this is actually helped by these hydrogen bonding events, right? So this negative charge is going to be attracted to that positive sodium, and those positive hydrogen molecules are going to be attracted to that chlorine, right? They're going to separate out into their ions in solution. This is what is referred to as an aqueous solution, okay? So chemical reactions, a process leading to chemical changes in matter involving the making and or breaking of chemical bonds. A chemical reaction involves rearranging atoms, but no atoms are created or destroyed. So it's important to note that no atoms are going to be created or destroyed. You cannot make an atom through chemical reaction, okay? Again, the way we make atoms, or the way that we synthetically have made atoms in a lab, are going to be through those super colliders, right? We're accelerating things extremely fast, near the speed of light, and colliding, and that's how we make an atom in a laboratory setting. But we cannot do this in biological systems. There is not enough energy in your body to create new atoms spontaneously. That would be an extreme amount of energy, okay? But you have these chemical reactions that can break down compounds, right? So here's hydrogen peroxide, and hydrogen peroxide can be broken down by an enzyme called catalase in your body, right? So catalase is added, it can break down these this compound into water, okay? Water and oxygen gas, okay? So this is actually the chemical reaction that occurs if you've ever had hydrogen peroxide, the 4% hydrogen peroxide, and you put it over a wound, and you see the bubbles come out from your cut because you're trying to sterilize your cut, or put anesthetic, this is an anesthetic, on your tissue, and then you see the bubbling or the foaming, and you're like, oh, it's working, right? And this is actually when this molecule comes into contact with your cut and the foaming occurs. It's actually reacting with the catalase present in your tissues or cells. So it's actually reacting with your body, right? So hydrogen peroxide is actually a peroxy radical. It's actually toxic in your body, but it's also toxic to microorganisms, okay? So that's why it's good to use as an anesthetic. We also have catalase, an enzyme that can break down hydrogen peroxide. So essentially you can destroy those tissues or those cells on that external cut, or but you have catalase that protects the internal tissues from this peroxy radical, okay? So if you've ever heard of antioxidants, right, they tell you to eat blueberries or dark colored berries in order to have these antioxidant properties in your body to prevent aging and early aging in the face and tissue, right? So we're looking at molecules or particles that can break down these so-called peroxy radicals. Hydrogen peroxide is a peroxy radical. It's a radical oxygen species, and it is damaging to the body, okay? So we do produce enzymes that can break this down, okay? And again, this is what we talk about. Eat your blueberries, eat your raspberries, eat the fruits that have high antioxidant content, right? In order to prevent these reactive oxygen species from forming in your body, causing damage, okay? So water and life. So life on Earth has always been closely tied to water. Life now is very closely tied to water, with your own cells containing 70 to 90% water, okay, which we are made majority of water, okay? Water has unique properties that allow for the support of carbon-based life. It is so exciting to find water sources on distant planets, because this could mean life has or may survive there, okay? So again, you hear on the news a lot of times, oh, water was found on Mars, water was found on this planet. Um, and that just alludes to how important water is uh, for the support of life. Okay, so water being found on a distant planet, a distant satellite planet, surrounding or rotating around a star somewhere. Scientists get excited. They say maybe this could be potentially an area where there is actual carbon-based life growing at the moment, right? Mars, same thing. They're constantly looking for life there because they know there's water there. Water is such a key component to life that when it's found on other planets, we think, oh, there could potentially be life there. All right. So cohesion of water. So cohesion of water and transport in plants. So water is attracted to water, right? So hydrogen bonding promotes or contributes to water being attracted to itself, right? If you've ever dropped water on a table, if you ever dropped a little bit of water on a table, you see the water kind of beat up and bind to each other, right? And this is going to be attributed to that hydrogen bonding. This is why certain types of insects can actually float on water and stand on the water. It can stand on the water's surface, right? Preventing that breakage of that surface layer, okay? Trees can also utilize this property of water through capillary action, okay? So if you've ever dipped a paper towel in water, in a cup of water, you see that the paper towel will absorb the water up, and that water can definitely travel up and out of that cup if there's enough water there, okay? And this is through capillary action. This is exactly how trees can actually pull water to the distant treetop through this mechanism, right? There's these different, they're called xylem and phloem tubes that are present in this tree. The xylem are going to be used to pull the water up. And again, trees have a very, very, I guess, efficient means of transporting water up to the top systems, okay? And it's through this capillary action. They utilize hydrogen bonding. So it's like a giant straw, but the energy is that's being expended to bring the water up is performed by this unique property of water. It's actually attributed to the hydrogen bonding and the attraction of water. So the more water that leaves the top of the tree or that the leaf system, the more water gets pulled up that tree, right? So trees will form this humid base at the top. You have the evaporation of water from the tree leaves, and then it'll actually promote the sucking or the removing of the water up into the phloem or xylem and pulling it up into the top leaf systems, okay? So again, it utilizes a hydrogen bonding and pulls that water up to the top where it can then be utilized by that tree. So a raft spider walking on water, the cumulative strength of hydrogen bonds between water molecules allows the spider to walk on pond water without breaking the surface, okay? So that hydrogen bond, those hydrogen bonds are exploited by other types of biological systems as well, such as a spider. Certain types of flies, I think a dragonfly can also perform this, but certain animals can definitely float on the top of the water without breaking the water surface. So they're essentially, they can stay dry even, okay? This is similar to what you would see with, I believe there's like an experiment where you take a paper clip and you lay it on the water and the paper clip can float on the surface of the water. That's attributed to hydrogen bonding, right? They have the negative and positive reaction of dipole, kind of linking that surface layer together, and then that paper clip can essentially float on the surface of that water, okay? What happens if you break those hydrogen bonds? That paper clip will not float, right? You can't take, let's say 95% ethanol and float a paperclip on it. There's just no hydrogen bonds there, right? But water, they do have the hydrogen bonds, therefore you can have those floating paperclips or those floating insects. The way you can break the hydrogen bond is actually through adding soap, right? So soap can get in between those hydrogen bonds and break that surface tension, therefore causing those different things not to float on that water anymore, right? So the addition of that soap into the water, you lose that surface tension, you break those hydrogen bonds, you stop the hydrogen bonds in that water, and again, you prevent the reactions of those dipoles, okay? Water also moderates temperature, okay? So water heats up much more slowly than conductive materials such as metals. Hydrogen bonds can absorb and give off tremendous amounts of energy that can then be released into the environment, okay? So hydrogen bonds can absorb energy, and this is a very important concept to understand. And this is why you may notice that ocean temperatures do not fluctuate too much. So anytime you go to the Central Coast, let's say Pismo or Cayucas, it's going to be that 70 or 65 to maybe 80 degrees year round, right? Maybe not even 80 degrees, 65 to 75 degrees, let's say. And that's because of the ocean, right? The ocean can absorb the energy and then release the energy at given times and throughout the year as well, right? If the ocean can absorb the heat during the day, it can then release that heat during the night. Therefore, you have a nice temperate climate there, okay? Those hydrogen bonds actually contribute to evaporative cooling as well. This is a property of water whereby a body becomes cooler as water evaporates from it. And this is why we sweat, okay? So again, water can moderate large bodies of water, their temperature, right? So oceans will have a nice even temperature throughout, typically throughout the year. And then evaporative cooling, this is going to be referring to the cooling of your body when you are sweating, okay? So think of this when you go on a run or you're working out and you come inside to a cool house, or even you turn on the AC in your car after the gym, and you feel that immense cool feeling, right? And it's when that air hits you and it hits your sweat and you immediately feel cold, right? And this is from that evaporative method of cooling, right? So when that liquid water actually evaporates, it's a process that requires energy, and it pulls the energy off your body, and then you have this cooling effect, right? If you're removing energy from your system, you're essentially cooling the energy, right? Because you're expending all this energy and heat from your muscles working, from your metabolism going overtime, and that sweat will actually cool your body off, okay, when it evaporates, removing that energy from your body and turning it into gaseous water, right? So, yeah. Okay, so why is this important? Oh, well, I'll give another example of this. So farmers in the area, we might know this as well. We typically, you see farmers flooding the fields during a frost, especially with oranges, okay? So people might wonder why do we flood the field with oranges? If you go outside soaking wet, you probably would freeze, right? You probably would not feel good. We would be hypothermic in a matter of an hour or so, okay? So why would you soak trees with water and then have the water freeze on the tree? Well, think of the reverse process of this, right? So if you go from water to gas, you have a transfer of energy. So a transfer of energy away from the body to the gas, okay? What happens if you go backwards? So if you freeze or have liquid water freezing, right? So it's a transfer of energy into the ice, okay? So it requires a pooling of energy that way, okay? So it's the opposite of sweating in certain ways, right? Because it's so cold, the energy is kept in that water. When that water freezes, giving off the energy to that plant, okay? So freezing needs water or energy removed, water freezes. Sweating requires gives water or energy to the water, therefore it evaporates, okay? So it's the same concept, it's the same thing. One is going to be maintaining heat on the trees to prevent the trees from freezing over. The other is going to be maintaining a cool body, right? So the evaporation of that water will again remove the energy from your body. Whereas the other way, that freezing of the water will give off that energy, right? You need to add or you need to remove that energy from the water in order to freeze it, right? And that energy can then be given to those trees. It can provide a warmer environment if that water freezes, okay? So why is this important? And this is just a cup of ice, but the ice is floating on the water. But why is this important? And this is very, very important, believe it or not. Okay. Actually, does anyone want to answer that in the chat? Why is floating ice important? Why is it important? Why do we even care? You don't need to speak up. You can just answer in the chat. That's more than sufficient. No one wants to answer? Or we're not paying attention anymore? All right. Well, I'm not going to force anybody. So water freezing is a big deal, and the ice floating is a big deal because most molecules or most elements that are frozen, or most compounds, I guess, that are frozen, are typically heavier, right? So if we go to liquid to a solid, the solids typically are going to be heavier, right? So if we have frozen ice or we have frozen water, and ice, again, this is going to float, okay, rather than sink. Imagine if ice were to freeze or water were to freeze and then it sank because it was too dense, right? It would literally crush everything underneath the surface of that water, right? Think of a lake. The lake freezes. Imagine that whole ice block was going to sink down to the bottom. You would literally crush everything alive under that water, okay? But instead, that water has the ice or the surface layer on top, and then you have the liquid water at the bottom, right? And water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius or about 32 degrees Fahrenheit. So at the bottom layer of that water, the liquid water can sustain life still, okay? While the top is frozen and protecting the water underneath from the harsh environment at the surface, right? So it's very, very important. So, and the reason for this is liquid water actually is more closely attracted to each other. Whereas when you freeze water, you form ice in this lattice structure here. So, and this is contributed to the hydrogen bonding, right? So you do have these hydrogen bondings, but they form this crystalline-like structure. And this crystal structure actually is less dense than liquid water, allowing this liquid water to float, or this frozen water to float. Okay, so here you have, it looks like seals, and then ice. Imagine this ice did not float. Again, essentially you would crush all the biological system or the organisms living underneath that ice. Again, it's important to note hydrogen bonding contributes to this lattice or crystal structure. Very, very, very important. Again, think of a snowflake, right? Snowflakes form these very beautiful structures because the water forms these crystal formations, right? This is going to be associated with these hydrogen bonding events. Okay, so liquid water more dense than frozen water. Key concept because again allows the ice to float. It also prevents the ice from smashing the biological systems underneath it. So important. So water is a solvent of life. The dissolving agent in a solution. Water is a most versatile known solvent. Again, it's polar. It can dissolve polar molecules. Okay, so like salts. A substance that is dissolved in a liquid is a solute, which is called the solvent. Okay, to form a solution. Aqueous solution, a solution in which water is the main solvent or is the solvent, right? So I refer to an aqueous solution of salt. Just think of water and salt mixed together. That's what an aqueous solution is. Okay. All right, so as a result of electrical charge attractions, water molecules surround the sodium and chlorine ions, dissolving the crystal in the process, right? So here we have chlorine, here we have sodium. Again, we have the hydrogen, the positive hydrogen is going to be attracted to that chlorine molecule, which is negative. And then here we have the sodium ion being attracted to by the oxygen molecules, right? These oxygens are surrounding that sodium. These hydrogen molecules are surrounding that chlorine, okay? Acid, bases, and pH. Acid is a substance that increases a hydrogen ion, H plus concentration in solution. Base is a substance that decreases a hydrogen ion, H plus concentrations in a solution. So just for all intents and purposes, that's what we'll get into with acids, right? So acids have a higher H plus or hydrogen concentration. Bases have a lower hydrogen concentration, right? So a pH scale is a measure of the relative acidity of a solution, ranging in value from 0, most acidic, to 14, most basic. Okay, so 0 to 14. So here we have a couple of different, I guess, solutions that we have around the house. Household bleach is very basic. Ammonia, milk of magnesia, very basic. Seawater, slightly basic. We have pure water, should be neutral at 7. Blood should be around neutral. Excuse me. Urine is getting acidic. We have black coffee, acidic. Tomato juice, acidic. Lemon juice is very acidic. That's why they tell you not to eat lemons. And then we have battery acid, and yeah, and we'll probably get into the high concentration acids further below. Okay. So just know that acidic pHs are going to be 7 to 1. Basic pHs are going to be 7 to 14. Okay. All right. So we're talking about ocean acidification by atmospheric carbon. So this is very important because we talk about CO2 and the excess carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. After dissolving in seawater, carbon dioxide reacts to form carbonic acid. This acid then undergoes further chemical reactions that disrupt coral growth or coral reef growth. Such acidification can cause drastic changes in important marine ecosystems. Okay, so think of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? And think of carbon dioxide that you breathe out as well. So if you have a glass of water, you can essentially carbonate that water as well. Okay, so if you take a straw, you take a deep breath, and you blow bubbles into that water, you're essentially adding carbon dioxide into that water, right? Because we breathe in oxygen, we exhale carbon dioxide. You can acidify a glass of drinking water. Okay, I've done this experiment with students before, where we add an indicator in the water that changes during acidic pH change. So if you breathe in carbon dioxide, you can essentially make carbonic acid, right? The carbonic acid, again, will acidify that water, and this can disrupt ecosystems, right? So this is why it's important. We regulate carbon dioxide. If there's a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, this water can dissolve carbon dioxide, and then it essentially acidifies the water, creating carbonic acid, which can then destroy ecosystems of coral. Okay. All right. That's it for today. Before lab, I guess. Any questions, concerns, comments? Everyone checked out. There's only 8 of you, so.